A boy begged not to leave school, with his uncle suspecting something. The teacher decided to follow them to their home. What she saw when she arrived at the house left her completely horrified. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Charlotte locked the classroom and let out a light sigh. She whispered to herself, another day completed, feeling both proud and very tired. Being a preschool teacher meant experiencing a daily roller coaster of emotions and challenges. Ever since she was little, her biggest dream had been to teach. As she walked through the school hallways, she reflected on the activity she had conducted that day, wondering if the children had enjoyed the story she told. She thought she needed to find more interesting books like that one. She headed to her car, following the same path she had taken for 6 years since she started working at Sunshine School. When she arrived home, she found the dinner that Jason, her husband who was still at work, had prepared. He always thinks of everything she thought with a smile, seeing her favorite stew on the stove. As she heated the food, she talked to herself. "Ah, Jason, you know how to cheer me up after a tiring day." Jason, though not the most famous cook in El Paso, had a great love for cooking. He made sure to prepare all the meals for the couple, always seeking to provide moments of calm for Charlotte. For him, cooking was a way to show his love and care, ensuring that Charlotte found joy and comfort in the dishes he prepared with such dedication. Due to their opposing work schedules, with Charlotte at school during the day and Jason at the restaurant in the evening, they had little time together during the week. But both were saving to fulfill their dream of buying a larger house and having a child. Seated at the table, Charlotte let her thoughts flow while she ate. "I need to think of a new way to teach math, maybe using games. Kids love games," she reflected as she slowly savored her meal. After dinner, Charlotte started to grade the students' activity books. "Let's see how you all did today," she said as she opened the books. She made detailed notes, thinking about each student. "Timothy is improving in writing, but Anna needs more help with math," she noted while marking the books with stars and encouraging comments. After finishing the grading, fatigue hit hard. Charlotte glanced at the clock, noting that it was still a while before Jason would arrive. Normally she waited for him, but that night she was too tired. She decided not to fight the sleep, quickly organized herself, and went to bed, leaving a note for Jason in the kitchen. The next day, Charlotte arrived at school renewed and ready for another day full of activities and learning. During the morning, while teaching a new song to the children, she was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. It was Dr. Michael Brown, the school principal, with a boy by his side. "Charlotte, may I have a word with you?" he asked. "In the principal's office, Doctor." Michael Brown introduced the new student. "This is Brian," he said, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. Brian looked shy, dressed in simple clothes and keeping his gaze low. "Brian will be joining your class from today," continued Dr. Michael Brown. Charlotte crouched down to be at eye level with Brian and smiled at him. "Welcome, Brian." "I'm so glad you're in our class," she said, trying to convey warmth and welcome. Brian, however, didn't react much, just nodding his head in acknowledgement. The principal then asked Charlotte to take Brian to the classroom and introduce him to the other children. "Of course, Doctor." Michael Brown, Charlotte replied, extending her hand to the boy. He followed her hesitantly, still without saying a word. Entering the classroom, Charlotte noticed the curiosity in the other children's eyes. "Everyone, we have a new friend in our class," she announced, encouraging Brian to step forward. "This is Brian. Let's make him feel welcome," the children responded with a chorus of "Hello, Brian," while he just waved timidly, still adjusting to the new environment. The class proceeded as usual, and Charlotte made an effort to include Brian in the activities. While walking around the room observing the students working, she noticed Brian's notebook. It was old, with worn edges and few blank pages left. She approached him and asked softly, "Brian, "Don't you have a new notebook for the start of the year?" Brian looked up at her, his brown eyes reflecting a subtle sadness. "This is all I have, teacher," he replied, lowering his voice. Charlotte felt a twinge of concern. She knew how important proper school materials were for children's learning. Without hesitation, she went to her locker and took out a new notebook, still wrapped. Returning to Brian's table, she placed the notebook in front of him. "Here, Brian. You can use this," she said, smiling to encourage him. Brian looked at the new notebook, his eyes lighting up a bit. "Thank you, teacher," he murmured almost inaudibly. During recess, Charlotte observed the children playing in the yard. Brian was sitting alone, away from the others. She approached another teacher and said, "I'm worried about Brian. He's always alone." Anna looked towards Brian and said, "It's normal, Charlotte. He just arrived. Kids take a while to get used to new classmates." Charlotte, nevertheless, couldn't help but worry. She watched Brian, who was playing with a piece of chalk, drawing on the ground. "Maybe I should try to integrate him more," she thought. When recess ended, Charlotte helped the children organize to return to the classroom. She noticed that Brian was the last to stand up, carefully gathering his school supplies and placing them inside his faded backpack. She approached him and said, "Brian, you draw very well. Would you like to show your drawings to the class someday?" Brian seemed surprised by the offer but shook his head no and walked towards the door. At the end of the school day, as the children left in the typical end-of-class commotion, Charlotte watched from a distance. Her eyes followed Brian, who walked slowly towards the school gate. From afar, she saw an older man approach him. The man looked older and wore simple clothes, much like Brian. He led the boy to an old car, and they both got in. Charlotte watched the car drive away, thinking that the man might be Brian's father. Back home, Charlotte found Jason, who had the day off. He was in the kitchen preparing something that smelled deliciously good. Seeing her, Jason smiled and asked, "How was your day, love?" Charlotte sat on the kitchen counter and started to tell him about Brian. "It's all right, but there's a new student in my class, Jason. He seems so lonely, and his things are so old. He didn't even have a place to write down the lesson." Jason, listening attentively, expressed his concern. "It's sad to think that a child doesn't have proper materials to study," he said while stirring something in the pot. "Do you know who his parents are?" Charlotte shook her head. "Not much. Today I saw a man pick him up. He seemed to be his father or maybe a relative. He was in a very old car," she continued. "He's very quiet. Today I gave him a new notebook because he was almost out of pages. You should have seen his face." Jason nodded, placing a hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "You always do your best for your students, Charlotte. I'm sure he'll open up more over time." As they talked, Charlotte felt a mix of concern and determination. She knew that as a teacher, she played an important role in her students' lives, and Brian would be no exception. She decided she would do her best to understand his situation and offer whatever help she could. The next day, Charlotte arrived at school early, ready for another day of work. She watched the children entering, noticing that Brian had not yet arrived. When he finally appeared, Charlotte immediately noticed the state of his clothes and nails, which were dirty. She felt a twinge of concern, questioning the conditions in which the boy lived. During recess, while the children ran to grab their snacks, Charlotte noticed that Brian only took out a squashed piece of bread from his backpack. In contrast, the other children had varied and colorful snacks. She remembered the sandwich Jason had made for her earlier. Without hesitation, she took the sandwich from her bag and approached Brian. "Brian, I brought an extra sandwich today. Would you like to try it?" asked Charlotte, offering the sandwich. Brian looked at the sandwich, then at Charlotte, clearly embarrassed. He shook his head, declining. But Charlotte insisted, "It's really tasty. I'm sure you'll like it." Reluctantly, Brian accepted the sandwich and began to eat, his expression revealing how hungry he was. Seizing the moment, Charlotte tried to talk to him. "Brian, that man who picks you up from school, is he your father?" she asked gently. Brian lowered his head and murmured, "No, he's my uncle. I don't know who my father is." Charlotte felt her heart tighten with the boy's response. It was clear there was much more to Brian's life than she had imagined. She sat next to him, trying to offer some comfort. "You can talk to me whenever you want, Brian." "I'm here to help," she said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Brian just nodded, saying nothing more. Charlotte realized that earning his trust would take time. Leaving Brian with his sandwich, Charlotte headed to the principal's office. "Dr. Michael Brown." She knocked gently on the door before entering, finding the principal seated behind his desk, surrounded by piles of papers. "Dr. Michael Brown, may I speak with you for a moment?" she asked. "Certainly, Charlotte." "What can I do for you?" he responded, looking up from his papers. Charlotte explained her observations and concerns about Brian, emphasizing her worries about his home conditions and lack of proper school materials. Dr. Michael Brown listened carefully, nodding as he heard her out. "I understand your concerns, Charlotte," he said. "We'll take note of the situation and see how we can offer support to Brian and his family." Charlotte felt a sense of relief. She knew that sometimes the most significant changes started with small actions, and that she had taken the first step in making a difference in Brian's life. At Charlotte's house, Brian was still a bit uncomfortable, but the welcoming environment seemed to be helping. "Do you like roast chicken?" Jason asked as he led him to the kitchen. Brian nodded timidly, and Jason continued, "Great, I'll make my special roast chicken for you." While Jason prepared dinner, Charlotte showed Brian where he would be sleeping and gave him some clean clothes she had bought on the way home. "You can wear these clothes, Brian. I hope they're comfortable," she said. Brian, still shy, thanked her quietly. After dinner, Charlotte led Brian to the guest room. When he went to change his clothes, she noticed through the slightly open door that he was surprisingly thin. Moreover, his shoes, old and worn out, seemed to have seen better days. "Brian, feel at home, okay? There's no reason to be afraid here," said Charlotte, trying to convey security. Brian, now dressed in clean and comfortable clothes, looked at Charlotte. "My uncle, he won't like seeing me here. He'll be upset with me," the boy said, his voice trembling with fear. Charlotte crouched down to Brian's level. "You're safe here, Brian. Nothing bad will happen. I promise," she tried to assure him, but the boy remained uneasy. Charlotte gently tried to learn more about the situation at home. "Brian, can you tell me what happens at home? If something is bothering you, I can try to help," she asked. However, Brian shook his head. "I can't, teacher. I promised my uncle I wouldn't talk about it. Can I go to sleep now?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. Charlotte felt a tightness in her chest hearing this. "Of course, Brian. I'll leave the door open. If you need anything, just call," she said, forcing a smile as she left the room. She gently closed the door, leaving a crack open, and headed to the living room where Jason was. Charlotte shared her observations and concerns. "Jason, this doesn't seem right. There's something very serious going on with Brian at his uncle's house. I need to do something. I can't just leave things as they are," she said, the determination in her voice clear. Jason looked at her, his eyes full of support. "I know you'll find a way to help, Charlotte. We're in this together," he replied. Charlotte woke up before sunrise, driven by a mix of determination and concern. She went to the kitchen and began preparing a hearty breakfast, thinking of Brian as she placed the dishes on the table. She called gently, "Brian, breakfast is ready." Jason joined them in the kitchen, trying to create a relaxed atmosphere as they ate. Jason tried to engage Brian in conversation. "So Brian, tell me more about your family," Jason said, trying to sound casual. Brian, however, seemed uncomfortable with the question and replied hesitantly, I can't talk about that." It was then that Brian, looking at the bread on the table, asked timidly, "Can I take one of these breads home? I'm always hungry, and sometimes there isn't much food." Hearing this, Charlotte felt a painful squeeze in her heart. "Of course you can, Brian. I'll prepare a nice snack for you to take," she said, forcing a smile to hide her concern. While Charlotte was preparing the snack, Brian watched with attentive eyes. He then murmured almost inaudibly, "It must be nice to have a family that takes care of you like this." Those words deeply touched Charlotte and Jason. They exchanged looks, their eyes filled with emotion. Jason, trying to keep his voice steady, replied, "You know, Brian, families are made in different ways sometimes. The most important thing is that there are always people who care about you." Charlotte nodded, adding, "And you will always have people who care about you, Brian. Always." As soon as they finished eating, Charlotte took Brian to school, feeling a mix of anxiety and concern. During classes, she struggled to focus on the activities, but her mind was always at the end of the day when she would have the opportunity to speak with Ronald, Brian's uncle. She needed to better understand the boy's situation and was determined to get some answers. As the afternoon progressed, Charlotte's anxiety grew. She was alert to every car that approached the school, waiting to see Ronald outside. Brian played alone, his expression darker than usual. Noticing this, Charlotte approached the boy. "Brian, are you okay? You seem worried," she asked gently. Before Brian could answer, a car stopped in front of the school. It was Ronald. He got out of the car and asked Brian how his day was. Then he turned to Charlotte and said with a speed that almost hid his intention, "Thanks for taking care of him, but I'm going to have to move Brian to another school." Upon hearing this, Brian reacted instantly, his eyes filled with tears. In a burst, he ran to Charlotte, clinging to her. "Please, teacher, don't let him take me. I don't want to go," the boy pleaded, sobbing. Charlotte felt her heart constrict at the sight of Brian's desperation. Ronald seemed surprised by Brian's reaction. He took a step toward the boy, but Charlotte intervened. "Ronald, what's going on? Why do you want to move Brian from school so suddenly?" she asked, her voice firm, despite the emotional turmoil. Brian continued clinging to Charlotte, crying inconsolably. Ronald hesitated, seeming uncomfortable with the situation. "With all due respect, teacher, but this is none of your business. I know what's best, not you." "Come on, Brian," now he said, already irritated. As Ronald put Brian in the car, Charlotte was momentarily paralyzed, watching the boy plead, "Please don't take me. I want to stay here," Brian screamed with tears streaming down his face. Ronald, without saying a word, just pulled him more firmly, ignoring the boy's protests. Charlotte, snapping out of her shock, started running toward the car. "Wait, Brian," she shouted, but it was too late. Ronald had already put the boy in the car and was getting into the vehicle. Charlotte stopped, panting next to the car, banging on the window. "Ronald, what are you doing?" "This isn't right," Ronald, without looking at Charlotte, just accelerated the car and drove off. Charlotte stood there, watching the car drive away, feeling a mix of anger and despair. "I have to follow them. I need to know where he's taking Brian," she thought, running to her car. As she drove, Charlotte tried to stay calm, but her heart raced. What's going on? What is this man hiding, she wondered, keeping a safe distance from Ronald's car. She thought about calling the police, but hesitated. What if I mess things up and make it worse for Brian? I need to be discreet. I don't know what this man is capable of, Charlotte considered, deciding to continue following Ronald on her own for now. First, I need to find out where they're going, she thought. Charlotte continued to drive, following Ronald's car through the streets. Her mind was focused, but her heart was heavy with worry. I'll find out the truth, Brian. I'll keep you safe, she silently promised, determined to do whatever was necessary to protect her student. Charlotte pressed the accelerator, trying to keep Ronald's car in her line of sight. He drove recklessly, increasing speed and making sharp turns. Charlotte knew she had to maintain distance but also could not lose sight of him. What is he trying to hide? Why is he driving so fast, she wondered, her heart pounding as she followed increasingly remote roads away from the city. The strangeness of the situation became ever more apparent. Ronald seemed to be heading toward a more isolated area, which only heightened the sense of urgency and danger. In a moment of calm, when she stopped at a red light, Charlotte quickly grabbed her phone and called Jason. "Jason, I'm following Brian's uncle. He's driving fast, and we're moving away from the city," she said, her voice shaking with the tension of the moment. On the other end of the line, Jason responded, his voice laden with worry. "Charlotte, this is very dangerous. You need to come back." "We don't know what this man is capable of," however, Charlotte was resolute. "I can't turn back now, Jason. I need to save this boy. I'm going to see this through," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. "I'm sending you my location," she added. Jason, on the other end, felt a mix of fear and admiration for Charlotte's courage. "I'm coming after you, but I'm far away. It'll take me a while to get there," he replied, already preparing to leave. As the light turned green, Charlotte resumed the pursuit. She knew she was putting herself in danger, but her concern for Brian and her desire to protect him outweighed any hesitation. She drove cautiously but determinedly, following Ronald's every move. With each mile traveled, the tension increased, but Charlotte was determined not to give up. Ronald had now turned onto a dirt road that wound through dense woods. She kept a safe distance to avoid making noise that might draw attention. The road led to a secluded area, and Charlotte felt a knot in her stomach thinking about what she might find there. Ronald's car eventually stopped beside a rudimentary shack surrounded by tall weeds and scattered trash. Charlotte parked her car a little distance away and moved quietly toward the shack. The door of the shack was ajar, and she could hear muffled voices coming from inside. Her heart pounded in her chest as she peered through the gap. Brian was seated on a small, dusty bed, looking scared. Ronald was speaking with another man in a harsh tone. Charlotte strained to hear their conversation, her breath held. "I don't know what you're trying to do here, but it's going to cost you. If you think I'm going to keep Brian with me, you're wrong," the other man said. Ronald replied with irritation, "Just make sure you're ready. I don't want any trouble." Charlotte felt a surge of fear and anger. She needed to act quickly. She took out her phone and quietly called the police, explaining the situation and giving them the location. As she waited, she observed Ronald and the other man more closely. They seemed to be arguing over something, but the conversation was too muffled for her to understand. Brian, meanwhile, was sitting quietly, tears still visible on his cheeks. Suddenly, Charlotte heard the sound of sirens approaching. She felt a rush of relief, but knew she had to stay hidden until the authorities arrived. Ronald and the other man appeared alarmed by the sound and began to move quickly. Ronald grabbed Brian's hand and tried to flee, but before they could get far, the police arrived and surrounded the area. Ronald was apprehended, and Brian was gently taken by the officers. Charlotte stepped out of her hiding place, her heart racing as she approached Brian. "It's okay now, Brian. You're safe," she said, trying to reassure him. Brian looked at her with a mixture of relief and confusion. "Thank you, teacher," he whispered. Charlotte hugged him tightly, grateful that she had been able to protect him. As the police took Ronald away, Charlotte stayed with Brian, answering questions and ensuring he was calm. "Everything is going to be all right, Brian. You're in good hands now," she said. The police officer who had been with her reassured Charlotte that they would take care of Brian and make sure he was placed in a safe environment. Charlotte nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief. "Thank you for everything," she said to the officer. As she watched the police car drive away with Ronald in the back, Charlotte felt a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. She had fought to protect Brian, and though it had been a harrowing experience, she was relieved that the boy was now safe. As we wrap up today's story, we've seen a powerful example of courage, compassion, and determination. Charlotte's unwavering commitment to protecting Brian from harm highlights the importance of standing up for what is right and supporting those in need. So what have you learned from this emotional journey? How does this story resonate with your own experiences and values? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below sharing one key lesson you've taken away from this story and how you plan to apply it in your own life. If you liked this video and found it meaningful, don't forget to give us a thumbs up, share it with others who might benefit from it, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. Your support helps us continue bringing valuable stories and insights to you. Thank you for watching.